The morning rush at Murphy's Diner hit like clockwork at 7:30, filling the cramped space with the familiar symphony of sizzling bacon, clinking coffee cups, and overlapping conversations. Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric already stained with coffee and grease despite the early hour. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floors and red vinyl booths that had seen better decades. "Order up!" Jimmy called from the kitchen, sliding 2 plates across the pass. Sarah grabbed them without looking. She'd been working these tables for 3 years and could navigate the diner blindfolded. But her eyes were already searching for table 7 in the corner, where Harold Thompson sat nursing his black coffee like it was medicine. Harold came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 8:15, ordering the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee. He always sat in the corner booth with his back to the wall, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug like it might disappear. The sleeves of his flannel shirt covered most of the faded tattoos on his forearms, but Sarah had glimpsed enough to know they weren't the kind you got at a party. "Morning, Harold," she said, setting down his usual without being asked. The smile came naturally. There was something about the quiet man that reminded her of her grandfather, another veteran who'd carried invisible wounds long after the war ended. Harold's gray eyes lifted briefly. "Morning, Sarah." "Thank you." His voice carried the rough edge of too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. Sarah had learned not to push conversation with Harold. He appreciated the routine, the normalcy of being treated like any other customer rather than a charity case or a hero. But today something seemed different. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the coffee cup, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked softly, refilling his cup. Harold hesitated, then shook his head. "Got a letter yesterday. From the city. They're saying I owe back taxes on my trailer. $3,000. He let out a bitter laugh. "Might as well be $3 million. Sarah's heart sank. She knew Harold lived in the old Sunset Mobile Home Park on the edge of town, a collection of aging trailers where rent was cheap and questions were few. It wasn't much, but it was home to people who couldn't afford anything else. "When do they want it?" she asked. 2 weeks, or they're taking me to court." Harold stared into his coffee. 40 years I served this country. 20 years active duty, 20 in the reserves. And now they want to put me out on the street over some paperwork mistake. The diner suddenly felt too loud, too bright. Sarah watched Harold's shoulders sag under the weight of a system that seemed designed to fail people like him. She'd seen it before. Veterans who came back broken in ways that didn't show, who fell through the cracks of a society that thanked them for their service, but forgot about them when the cameras stopped rolling. "There has to be something," she started. "There isn't." Harold's voice was final. "My disability check barely covers food and rent as it is. Already talked to 3 lawyers. None of them want to touch it for what I can pay." Sarah refilled his coffee again, her mind racing. She'd grown up in this town, watched it change from a thriving industrial center to another Rust Belt casualty. She'd seen good people ground down by circumstances beyond their control, but something about Harold's quiet resignation sparked a fire in her chest. "Don't give up yet," she said quietly. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Harold managed a small smile. "You're good people, Sarah, but some fights you just can't win." As Sarah walked away, she couldn't shake the image of Harold sitting alone in that booth, carrying burdens that should have been shared by a grateful nation. Outside the diner windows, the gray October sky pressed down on Main Street like a heavy blanket, and she wondered how many other Harold Thompsons were sitting in diners across America, forgotten by the very country they'd sworn to protect. 2 weeks later, Sarah's shift started with an empty table 7. Harold hadn't shown up for his usual Tuesday breakfast, and the absence felt like a missing tooth. She kept glancing at the corner booth between orders, hoping to see his familiar silhouette hunched over black coffee. The morning crowd was thinner than usual. October had brought layoffs at the remaining factory, and people were cutting back on small luxuries like restaurant coffee. Sarah wiped down empty tables and tried not to think about her own bills piling up at home. Tips had been light lately, and her mother's medical expenses weren't getting any smaller. At 10:30, just as the morning rush died down, Harold walked through the door. But something was wrong. His usual slow, measured gait had been replaced by the unsteady shuffle of a man carrying invisible weight. His flannel shirt was wrinkled, and his gray hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. "Sarah," he said, sliding into his usual booth. His voice was hoarse. "I need to ask you something." She hurried over with the coffee pot. her heart already sinking. What happened? Harold pulled a legal document from his coat pocket and smoothed it on the table with shaking hands. Court date's tomorrow. They're not just coming after the taxes anymore. The city's saying I violated housing codes, that my trailer's not up to standard. They want to condemn the whole property and sell it to some developer. Sarah scanned the official paperwork, the legal language swimming before her eyes. She recognized enough to understand the stakes. Harold wasn't just facing eviction, he was looking at homelessness. What about the other residents? She asked. All got the same papers. Mrs. Chen, the Rodriguez family, old Pete who lost his leg in Vietnam. 23 families, all of us getting thrown out so some company can build condos. Harold's jaw tightened. They scheduled all our hearings for the same day, trying to rush it through before anyone can organize a proper defense. You need a lawyer. With what money? Harold's laugh was bitter. The public defender they assigned me is some kid fresh out of law school. Met with him for 10 minutes yesterday. He basically told me to plead out and try to negotiate a payment plan I can't afford. Sarah stared at the summons, anger building in her chest like steam in a kettle. She'd watched this town slowly die for years, seen local businesses shuttered while chain stores moved in, watched families forced out as property taxes rose. But this felt different. This felt like theft, disguised as progress. What if someone spoke for you? She asked suddenly. At the hearing, someone who knows you, who can tell the judge what kind of person you are. Harold shook his head. It's not a character hearing, Sarah. It's about money and regulations. They don't care that I served my country or that I keep my property clean. They just want us gone. But what if they did care? What if someone made them remember that you're not just a case number, that you're a human being who deserves better? For the first time since he'd walked in, Harold's eyes showed a flicker of something other than resignation. You'd do that? Speak up for an old soldier you barely know? Sarah reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with hers. You're not just an old soldier, Harold. You're my friend. And friends don't let friends fight alone. Outside the diner windows, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, coating Main Street in a deceptive blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But Sarah knew that beneath the snow, the same problems remained. Poverty, neglect, and a system that valued profit over people. Tomorrow she would walk into that courthouse and try to speak for a man who had already given more than his share. She didn't know if her words would matter, but she knew she had to try. The Hamilton County Courthouse squatted on the town square like a brick monument to bureaucratic indifference, its steps worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice they rarely found. Sarah climbed those steps at 9:45, 15 minutes before Harold's hearing, her hands trembling despite the warmth of her good dress, the navy blue one she'd bought for her grandmother's funeral and rarely worn since. Inside, the building smelled of old wood and older disappointments. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the yellowed walls lined with portraits of stern-faced judges from another era. Sarah's heels clicked against marble floors as she searched for courtroom C where Harold's case was scheduled. She found him sitting alone on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, his public defender nowhere in sight. Harold wore his only suit, a brown polyester relic from the 80s that hung loose on his shrinking frame. His hands rested on his knees, completely still for the first time since she'd known him. How are you holding up? She asked, settling beside him. Been through worse, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Though I'm not sure when. The hallway filled slowly with the other residents of Sunset Mobile Home Park. Mrs. Chen clutching a manila folder of documents, the Rodriguez family huddled together speaking rapid Spanish, old Pete leaning heavily on his cane. They all had the same look Harold wore, the resigned expression of people who'd learned not to expect much from the system. At exactly 10 o'clock, a bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Thompson versus City of Hamilton, he called. You're up. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided over the courtroom like a queen on her throne, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her expression. She'd been hearing cases in Hamilton County for 15 years, and her reputation for efficiency was matched only by her impatience with anything that slowed down her docket. Harold's public defender, a nervous young man named David Chen, who couldn't have been out of law school more than 6 months, shuffled papers at the defendant's table. Across the aisle, the city attorney, a sharp-suited woman named Victoria Palmer, sat surrounded by thick files and the confident bearing of someone who rarely lost. Your Honor, Palmer began, her voice crisp and professional. This is a straightforward case of housing code violations and unpaid taxes. Mr. Thompson has failed to maintain his property to city standards and owes $3,147 in back taxes. The city is seeking immediate remedy through forfeiture and sale of the property. Judge Hawkins nodded briskly. Mr. Chen, how does your client plead? The young public defender stood slowly. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the tax debt but disputes the housing code violations. We request time to arrange a payment plan. Mr. Thompson is on a fixed income, Your Honor, Sarah called out, rising from the gallery. He's a veteran who served this country for 20 years. Ma'am, you are not part of these proceedings, Judge Hawkins interrupted, her voice sharp. Please remain seated or I'll have you removed. But, Your Honor, if you would just listen. Palmer smirked at her table. Several court clerks exchanged glances, barely suppressing smiles. Even the bailiff looked amused. Here was a waitress in a cheap dress, thinking she could argue law with the professionals. Your Honor, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite the churning in her stomach. Harold Thompson fought for our freedom. He's lived in this community for 8 years without a single complaint. These violations are minor maintenance issues that could be fixed with a little time and help. Miss, I will not warn you again, Judge Hawkins said, her gavel hovering threateningly. This is a court of law, not a platform for emotional appeals. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, quiet but audible. The city attorney didn't bother hiding her smile now. Harold's young lawyer looked mortified, and Harold himself had sunk lower in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment. But Sarah remained standing. Your Honor, with respect, this man gave 20 years of his life to serve our country. He came home with injuries you can't see, and he's done his best to rebuild. If we can't find room in our community for our veterans, what does that say about who we are? It says we follow the law, Palmer interjected smoothly. Emotional appeals don't change the fact that Mr. Thompson owes money he can't pay and lives in substandard housing. More scattered laughter. Judge Hawkins raised her gavel. Miss, you will sit down now or... The courtroom doors burst open with a bang that echoed off the high ceilings like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the sound, and Sarah's words died in her throat as she saw the figure striding down the center aisle. The man wore a crisp military uniform covered in ribbons and decorations, his silver hair immaculate despite the obvious haste of his arrival. Stars gleamed on his shoulders, 2 of them, marking him as a major general. His face was weathered but sharp, his blue eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to command. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders in combat zones. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding about Sergeant Harold Thompson. The courtroom fell silent, except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Judge Hawkins lowered her gavel slowly, her stern expression replaced by something approaching awe. Even Victoria Palmer seemed to shrink slightly in her chair as the general's presence filled the room. General Marcus Stone, United States Army, the man said, stopping beside Harold's table. I was Harold Thompson's commanding officer during his final deployment in Afghanistan. I came as soon as I heard about these proceedings. Harold stared up at his former CO with eyes wide with disbelief. Sir, I don't understand. How did you... Your friend here, General Stone nodded toward Sarah, who remained standing in shock, sent a very eloquent email to the Pentagon 3 days ago. It took some doing to track you down, Sergeant, but we don't abandon our own. Sarah felt her legs nearly give out. The email. She'd sent it in desperation Sunday night, working from Harold's old discharge papers and her grandmother's ancient computer. She'd never expected anyone to read it, much less respond. Judge Hawkins cleared her throat. General Stone, while we appreciate your service, this is a municipal court matter involving housing codes and tax debt. Your Honor, with respect, this matter involves a decorated combat veteran who was wounded in service to his country. The general's voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable steel. Sergeant Thompson served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earning 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. He was injured by an IED while leading a convoy that saved 17 civilian lives. The general reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I have here documentation of Sergeant Thompson's exemplary service record, his medical history showing service-connected disabilities, and letters from his unit members attesting to his character. Harold's young lawyer looked like Christmas had come early. Even Palmer seemed less certain now, shuffling through her files as if looking for different ammunition. Furthermore, General Stone continued, I've been in contact with the Veterans Administration regarding Sergeant Thompson's benefits. It appears there was an error in processing his disability rating that resulted in underpayment of his monthly compensation. That error has been corrected, and Sergeant Thompson will receive approximately $8,000 in back pay within 10 days. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. Harold sat straighter in his chair, 20 years falling away from his shoulders as his military bearing reasserted itself. Judge Hawkins studied the documents General Stone had placed before her. This is quite impressive, Sergeant Thompson. General Stone, you mentioned the young lady's email. What exactly did she tell you? The general turned to look at Sarah, his stern expression softening slightly. She told me that one of my soldiers was in trouble, and that his community wasn't standing up for him the way he'd stood up for his country. She was wrong about one thing, though. Sarah's heart skipped. Sir? She said his community wasn't supporting him. But here she is, a young woman who barely knows him, willing to stand up to a judge and a lawyer to speak for a veteran in need. That tells me everything I need to know about both of them. Palmer finally found her voice. Your Honor, while this is all very touching, it doesn't change the housing code violations. Actually, it does. General Stone produced another set of papers. I contacted the VA's Specially Adapted Housing Program this morning. Sergeant Thompson's service-connected disabilities qualify him for up to $63,000 in home modification grants. The violations cited by the city appear to be accessibility issues that the VA will fund repairs for. The courtroom was dead silent. Harold stared at the papers in wonder, as if they might disappear if he looked away. Judge Hawkins set down her reading glasses. Mr. Palmer, it appears the city's case has some significant complications. Given Sergeant Thompson's service record and the resources now available to address the cited issues, I'm prepared to dismiss these proceedings entirely, contingent on verification of the VA payments and housing assistance. Your Honor, Harold's young lawyer said, finding his voice for the first time, we accept those terms gratefully. Palmer gathered her papers with obvious frustration. Very well, Your Honor. As the gavel fell dismissing the case, the small gallery erupted in quiet celebration. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. The Rodriguez family embraced. Old Pete saluted the general with his free hand. Harold stood slowly and extended his hand to General Stone. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Sergeant, thank her. The general nodded toward Sarah. That young lady wrote one hell of a letter. Reminded me why we serve, to protect people like her who still believe in doing the right thing. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as Harold turned to her with eyes bright with unshed tears. Sarah, You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. You already gave enough. As they walked out of the courthouse together into the bright October afternoon, Sarah realized something had changed. The same problems still existed. Poverty, neglect, indifference. But she'd learned something important. Sometimes one person willing to stand up and speak truth could change everything. 3 months later, Harold Thompson's renovated trailer became the model for the VA's new accessible housing initiative. Sarah Martinez left the diner to work as a veterans advocate, using the same email skills that had brought a general running to help other forgotten soldiers. And every Tuesday and Thursday morning, General Stone still met Harold for coffee at Murphy's Diner. 2 old soldiers sharing stories and black coffee while the world slowly learned to remember its debts.